Hi, welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be exploring a topic that's very closely tied to the concept of the self that we've been looking at through numerous different angles over the last few lectures. When we talk about something called attitudes, before we get into the ways that we can form attitudes and shift them and some other components to them that are very important, I think it's probably first important just to understand what attitudes are all about. So to get a better sense of what we're looking at as social psychologists in this concept of attitudes, I thought we'd start today off, like we usually do in most of these lectures, with an activity. In this activity, what I want you to do is just think about some things that you prefer. You can start with, say, what your favorite drink flavor is, be it a soda flavor like Coke, or Pepsi, or Dr. Pepper, or root beer, or something along those lines. And if you can think about what one that is, I'd love for you to also think about why you have that specific preference. Then I'd like you to think about, say, a favorite color that you have and why maybe that favorite color is your color of choice. And lastly, I want you to think about your favorite number, where you came to kind of conclude that that's your favorite number. And if you don't, say, have a favorite color, or favorite number, or favorite drink of choice, try to assess why that's maybe the case. Once you're done thinking about those three things, maybe writing them down if you're so inclined to do so, let's explore how what you just did there relates to attitudes. So what are we looking at when we talk about attitudes? If you did that activity, what you were really talking about is your opinions, your biases towards or against specific things. That's what attitudes are all about, but it's not just about preferences for, say, colors or drinks, objects, but it can also relate to our preferences for groups or specific individuals or specific ideas. And when we look at attitudes in social psychology, there's this kind of two-way street that lots of individuals explore. One of the places people look at is where these attitudes are coming from in the first place. Trying to understand the behaviors that might lead to attitudes, the plans that we have that might cause us to develop specific attitudes, and even the emotions that we might feel in specific situations that give us a better sense of the attitudes we form. In essence, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in previous lectures relating to the self can definitely have some hindrance on the formation of attitudes that we have. But it's also important to note, as I mentioned, that this is a two-way street, which means once we form attitudes, these things do theoretically impact our behaviors. They impact the goals that we set in our life, and they also impact the emotions that we feel when we find ourselves in new novel situations. It's very tough sometimes to untether attitudes from these components, but if we really want to understand the attitudes of an individual, we have to appreciate that there are multiple aspects to them, both pushing attitudes in the directions that they are and that get pushed by the attitudes that people form. But it's also important to note when we talk about this push and pull that attitudes don't always happen on the surface level. When I asked you what your favorite number was or favorite color was, you probably had a pretty quick recognition of these preferences. You might find yourself throughout your life picking things because they're the same color that you like, or they maybe have the same number that you prefer, or maybe even, it's based on some preference that you can explicitly state in your life. But many social psychologists over the years have asked, are there other attitudes that we possess that maybe are operating below the surface, that still evoke emotions, still impact our drives, still impact the decisions that we make, but do it in a way that we're completely unaware of? And this eventually led to the development of the differentiation between what we call implicit and explicit attitudes. It's very easy for social psychologists to measure, quantify, and then use the attitudes we know we have to kind of understand how they impact our social world. It's been significantly more challenging in social psych research when we started to suggest that we might have attitudes that are operating below the surface that are impactful, for us to see how these things might really change the way we see the world and react with it. But as we've progressed as social psychologists, we've started to develop tools that can help us understand some of the more subtle ways that our mind might be organized to kind of push us in directions linked to our attitudes in ways that we don't know. One of the classic tests is one that you actually see a link to here called the implicit association test. You can look at your attitudes on a whole wide range of things relating to things like race and age and ableism and other concepts that tend to be the kind of ways that lots of individuals today categorize people and theoretically have attitudes that are formed that maybe are happening below the surface. And we're going to talk a little bit more in later weeks about how stereotypes and the biases and attitudes that come with it need to be quantified through these things, and we can use them for predictive purposes. But just for now, I want us to appreciate that even though most of this week's work is going to look at attitudes on the surface, or opinions about political ideas or specific name brands or things that we might prefer, there's a whole slew of research that's also looked at attitudes that are operating below the scenes. The ones that could potentially, as the kind of image hidden behind this slide suggests, impact, say, who we decide to hire for a job interview or who we decide to befriend when there's a large number of people in a crowd. Subtle things that maybe we're completely unaware of could have a big impact on our lives and our everyday behaviors. And that's what implicit attitude research aims to try to understand. But we're going to, again, focus a lot on explicit attitudes because in this class, we can tackle a lot just with focusing on that one aspect of our attitudes. Promise I'm not saying that implicit attitudes aren't important. We will get to them to an extent and talk about especially the negative connotation to many implicit attitudes that people might form later on in a couple weeks. But just looking at explicit attitudes provides us with this wide array of things we can understand. And this wide array usually leads us to the same question that we've asked in lots of the topics that we've looked at. If we're talking about attitudes, what are the social factors that impact them? If attitudes do affect our behaviors, our drives, our emotions, what's pushing those attitudes in the first place? And if we look at our history, what we see is large numbers of individuals that appreciated the power of changing attitudes, even if they hadn't necessarily developed the scientific tools that we have today and the terms that we use today to better understand and explain some of the ways that we can shift attitudes around the world. We're looking at the first indicators of kind of strong attempts to use attitudes on a research basis. We actually have to go back a little over 100 years ago to World War I, when many individuals started to try to create stories and kind of scenarios to push individuals on both sides of the war to have attitudes about their own country and the reason for, the justification for a very bloody and sad and tragic war. As World War II started to pick up, many individuals actually started to try to quantify how much they could shift attitudes of individuals by creating the perfect concocted message. What you see in front of you is a collection of different posters and images that were strewn along different cultures and different places in his attempt to try to either really solidify a base or get people to question their allegiances or ideas through some type of what we nowadays call propaganda. And what we see is that these things were used on a regular basis because there were lots of quantifiable results that were coming from some of the early studies that tried to understand the impacts of attitudes. It eventually led to a situation where many individuals became more polarized than they ever thought they could be as a result of the perfectly catered messages like Rosie the Riveter that became mainstream throughout the country in lots of different parts, not only in the United States, but around the world. And eventually led not only to big governments and large entities to try to get people to form specific attitudes through some type of quantifiable measure, but it also led to companies recognizing the power and utility of creating messages that were concocted in a way that would get people to shift their feelings and beliefs about specific concepts. One of the most often cited examples of how companies immediately shifted the philosophy and attitudes of an entire nation is a story of a small cigarette company named Virginia Slims, who in the 1960s started taking out ads on the backs of different magazines that pictured beautiful, healthy, vivacious women who always were doing something extremely active. And next to them was often a picture of this cigarette, small name brand cigarette named Virginia Slims, and a phrase that said, "You've come a long way, baby." Now, they were very intentional in their attempts to make sure that the woman always looked healthy, to ensure that she never had any cigarette in hand or near her, and that there was no implications that she was doing anything less than just being wholesome and wonderful. And this was because Virginia Slims was attempting to do something pretty amazing at the time. If we take a time machine back about 70, 80 years ago, what we would find is that many people smoked, but there was only one half of the population, or roughly a half of the population, where smoking was considered more socially acceptable, and that was males within the 1960s. Females and other individuals in the 1960s that didn't qualify as male were considered sort of devious or scandalous if they smoked. It's not that women didn't necessarily smoke back then, it's just they had to do it in private, or they might be assumed to be something that was less than wholesome and savory, something that was definitely not considered an acceptable thing in the 1960s. So women would, again, smoke in private, never really telling individuals that they did that. And when Virginia Slims recognized that there was this huge percentage of the population that was probably smoking, but doing it in shame, doing it in a way that led them to kind of hide their behaviors, they realized that they could tap into something and take advantage of it by just changing people's attitudes. They became synonymous with women's liberation and healthy living, even if you were willing to smoke. It might seem kind of counterintuitive to think that health and excitement and being independent could be tied to cigarettes today, but for a large span of time, Virginia Slims shot up the ranks of the most popular cigarette companies out there through this attempt to get vast numbers of women to kind of come out of the shadows and smoke in public, and do it with, of course, these Virginia Slims in hand. It's not necessarily the most popular brand today, but it's still in circulation, and it really speaks to the power that people started to identify when they understood a little bit better about how attitudes could be formed and how that could shape a lot of our daily behaviors. This also led, when the internet and other things started to pick up, to some more intriguing kind of outside the box thinking of how we could get people to become aware of things and potentially change their attitudes when we tried to get at them a little bit more subtly. There was one individual back in the, I believe it was early 1990s, named Andrew Fisher, who went on eBay when it was just being established and posted a photo of him saying that he would put somebody's ad on his head in non-permanent ink for 30 days. It just was the highest bidder that would win his forehead. And because it was so novel and interesting, and it became semi-popular at the time, a large number of companies started bidding. Bidding started relatively small, and when people started to recognize the popularity of it and started to be intrigued by how this could change behaviors, it eventually led to a bidding war where a company named SnoreStop actually bid $38,000, roughly $38,000, to have Fisher put their company's name or their company's logo on his forehead. I'm not sure it was exceptionally effective, since I don't believe SnoreStop exists anymore, but it led to a whole new game for advertisers where we started to try to influence people's attitudes and their behaviors through odd things like putting names and logos on random things that we encounter every day. Another example of the time was a woman named Elisa Harp, who, when she found out she was pregnant, argued that she would, not argue, but contended that she would put somebody's name, whatever company it was, on her belly during the last month and a half of her pregnancy, so people would see in her belly whatever company they would, I guess, put on her stomach. And oddly enough, just to make things even weirder, a casino, an online casino company named GoldenPalace.com was the top winner, and they actually bid about $8,800 for that name to be put in non-permanent ink, for you worrying, on Elise Harp's stomach. Now, it's probably important to identify there the drop in price for putting something on a person's forehead to somebody putting something on their stomach within a few months. This was definitely more of a fad, but it also spoke to this new push, something that's still around today, in fact, much stronger today than it was just a few decades ago, where people recognized the importance of attitudes and how much they shifted behaviors and shifted our interpretations of the world. And it led to people trying to figure out how we can get these attitudes to form or change in the first place. In essence, it led to a whole bunch of people being interested in something that social psychologists had studied for decades, this topic of something that we call persuasion. The attempts to get people to either form or change an attitude on a topic through some type of message. When we talk about the type of message that exists, it's important to note that one of the ways that social psychologists discuss messages is by divvying it up into two different categories. We often talk about attempts to try to get people to form attitudes or change them or some type of direct message, something called a central route to persuasion. So if I were to say, get you to try to be convinced that a certain brand of shoe was significantly better than others because of its stitching and because of its fit to the foot and its comfort levels and its ability to last a long time, my attempt to get you to buy that shoe or that brand would be some type of central route to persuasion. If I, however, got you to try to buy a brand of shoe through, say, sorry about that, through, say, I don't know, putting pretty pictures up of the shoe and having people dance and talk about how much they love the shoe without giving any specifics on the topic, I would be using something that we call a peripheral route to persuasion. And if you look around in media today, we're inundated with both central and peripheral routes to persuasion. Sometimes people do try to get us to invest in something or to purchase something or to avoid something through some presentation of facts, be they accurate or not. Other times, people do put up some type of dancing bear or random picture or something pretty to try to get individuals interested in a product just because their attention has sort of been drawn to that area. And this might bring us to a very important question, and that's which approach works best. It's important to note that there's a reason why we have both central and peripheral routes to persuasion inundating us at all times. The reason is it really depends on the situation to determine which approach of central or peripheral routes to persuasion actually work best. And it leads us to a really interesting model that started to be discussed in the 1980s called the elaboration likelihood model. It was one that surmised that if we care about something, if we really do want to form an attitude about something, or we recognize how important that attitude is to us, and the best route to persuasion at that point is what we call a central route to persuasion. If if we don't necessarily care about something, if it's not something that we think is really going to impact us much, then usually the best way to get us to form an attitude or to change an attitude is usually through those routes that we call peripheral routes to persuasion. And a trio of individuals who were the first to really highlight this elaboration likelihood model were researchers named Petty, Cacioppo, and Goldman, who in 1981 ran a study that invited participants to come in and listen to what was argued to be a debate between two individuals on whether or not the school that they happened to be a part of would implement some type of an exit exam at some point in time. Now, half of the participants were told that they were going to listen to a debate between two people, and this was going to be about the potential for an exit exam happening this year, something that could potentially impact their ability to graduate. Others were told that this debate was not necessarily something that was going to apply to them, and it would be something that could potentially happen 10 years from now. After being told one of these two things, not of course knowing that there was an alternative thing they could have been told, but being told one of these two things, they then listened to a professor having pretty crummy arguments about, I believe if I recall correctly, why they shouldn't have exit testing. And this professor, giving relatively crummy arguments, just to kind of add some spice to it, had the occasional applause that was happening in the background. After the professor gave the very uninspiring argument for having testing exams, or exit exams, a college student came on and gave an argument for having, after the professor gave an argument for not having them, a college student then came on and gave an argument for having them. And in this study, Petty, Cacioppo, and Goldman made sure that there was no applause or anything happening in the background, just the occasional murmur, to kind of suggest that the audience wasn't necessarily in agreement with the student. After people listened to these two arguments, again, regardless of which condition they were in, they were then asked to rate the quality of the arguments and also rate whether or not they agreed with one idea or the other. What they found in this study was that which instructions they were given had a huge impact on the way they interpreted the information. When people were led to believe that this was about something that was going to impact them, in essence the test could potentially happen now, most people gave the student a little bit higher rating than the professor. And most people argued that their opinions were actually shifted a little bit, if not entirely, as a result of the argument that the student had given. When people were told that this was something that was going to happen 10 years from then, very few of them sided with the student. Most of them sided with the professor and the relatively crummy arguments and went with the clapping and everybody else that they had heard. In essence, again, it implied that if there's something we care about, we tend to listen to the arguments. Central routes to persuasion work well. If there's something we don't necessarily care about, well then the only way to really get us to move, to shift the dial, is through a peripheral route to persuasion. And this has been proven time and time again since this study in 1981 by Petty, Cacioppo, and Goldman. There's numerous citations that you might come across to kind of highlight how impactful what we care about is in determining what advertisement works best. But there's also a lot of research that's looked at things that can sort of trump this situation, things that can steer us away from this elaboration likelihood model. One thing that seems to matter a lot is who we are and how messages impact us in general. There are some people in the population that have a very high, what we call need for cognition. It's actually more of a motivational concept than a social psych concept, but it applies so aptly in this research. It's something that we often cite. If a person has a very high need for cognition, more often than not, even if something doesn't necessarily pertain to them, the most effective messages are always going to be central routes to persuasion. There's also individuals who fall in the bottom echelon of the need for cognition. ones that don't necessarily enjoy thinking about a lot of stuff and more just kind of react to things without having to process every element of the world around them. For those individuals low on the need for cognition, we tend to see peripheral routes to persuasion work for them almost every time. Very rarely do central routes to persuasion have much impact on them, even if it is, and this is kind of odd, something they theoretically in these fleeting moments care about. Well, it's also important to highlight, though, that most of us don't fit into the extremes that most of this research focuses on. Most of us are maybe not necessarily right in the middle on need for cognition, but unless we're in the extremes, well, then this elaboration likelihood model probably wins out. There's exceptions, but it usually wins out versus this kind of trump card of the need for cognition. Another thing that is measured a lot is how impactful these messages can be just in general based on other underlying characteristics. What we tend to see is that both central and peripheral routes to persuasion don't work very well on us when we get older. We tend to form attitudes and stick with them for a large portion of our life, regardless of the information that we encounter. When we look at younger individuals, both central and peripheral routes to persuasion can be very effective. What's also worth noting here, and this is something that was actually highlighted in the research of a very famous cognitive psychologist who also studied lots of social psychology concepts named Elizabeth Loftus, was that peripheral routes to persuasion seem to be especially potent for young children. Adolescents, teens can be moved in ways that most adults cannot through weird persuasive techniques that don't necessarily address something specific. You might recall moments when you were, say, 9, 10, 11 years old and just forming perceptions of the world and having information come to you, like a friend prefers something or somebody said something about something, and immediately you might gravitate towards that idea or against that idea depending upon your feelings of those individuals. Age does matter is the important thing I want you to get from that. Another thing that does matter in terms of the overall efficacy of persuasion is how capable we are of even identifying the message. Peripheral routes can work in subtle ways even when we don't care, but if those messages aren't even reaching our attention, the odds of them working are just as good as the odds of central routes to persuasion that we're not paying attention to. There's also numerous studies that have shown that if we're tired, if we're not thinking about the self, if we've got other things going on, it's very challenging to get us to form or change attitudes regardless of the message that's conveyed. And I guess if we're looking at this from an advertiser's perspective, it is probably important to note that the fleeting chance we have to get somebody to form or change an attitude in those situations tends to be in the peripheral form. Even if something really does matter to somebody, if they're distracted, they're tired, if they're just not there, it's really tough to change an attitude or form it unless you've come up with something that can maybe catch their eye for a fraction of a second. But it's really important to note when talking about all these things that an elaboration likelihood model, even with all these caveats, does tend to work a lot more often than we think. And we do think it's the source of how, as we transition from teenagers to early adults to middle adults and later, we start to become entrenched in a lot of the attitudes that we have. Another interesting topic that pertains to both attitudes, persuasion, and even advertising at this point isn't whether or not we necessarily are more impacted by central or peripheral routes, but it's more about what types of message within those routes are most effective. If we're looking at one of the more commonly leaned upon topics that people have explored over the last few years, it's usually a topic that we've discussed before. Those emotions that we've not only talked about on their own, but incorporated into a number of different lectures. What we've recognized throughout the years is that emotions can be very big players in the efficacy of different persuasive messages. And certain emotions seem to work really well in comparison to others. The most potent emotion that many advertisers have started to latch onto, or people trying to persuade individuals have latched onto, is that emotion of fear. What we've seen in numerous studies is that fear can be a very strong motivator to get individuals to not only form specific attitudes, but to act on those specific attitudes that they have. If we're looking for a prime example of this taking place in our current society, look no further than the political spectrum that we find ourselves in the United States. Numerous individuals each day are persuaded to donate large amounts of money, take very strong stances on things, and act in ways that usually revolve around some of the fear-based messages that many politicians from both sides of the spectrum are pushing on their constituents. I'm not necessarily saying that the messages that evoke fear are incorrect or unethical. What I am saying is that there is a recognition by many people in multiple areas that fear is a very big motivator. It gets many people to act and to solidify their stances on things in ways that many other emotions just can't do. If we're looking for how we might be able to nudge people in topics that maybe aren't critical to them, well, this is when we get to another emotion of happiness. There have been numerous studies that have shown that when we're happy or when we're intrigued by something, we do become a little bit more receptive to messages being presented. And this is especially true when we look at those peripheral routes to persuasion that we've explored. It's not nearly as potent as those fear-arousing messages that we've talked about, but it can have its effects. The only thing I need to also add to those fear-based emotion studies is that there does seem to be a limit to how fearful you can make individuals. Numerous studies and numerous groups have found that if you evoke fear, you can often get people to act, but if the fear you evoke is so great and debilitating, you can actually cause individuals to sort of freeze up, to not act, to not move, even if they are forming those attitudes that you'd like to get them to form. And oftentimes when it comes to marketing or advertising or even some social approaches, the actions are more important to these individuals than the attitudes themselves. So many people in politics and sales and other areas have really tried to hit home with this message to advertisers and other people trying to persuade people that in addition to having some type of fear-evoking message, you also need to find some kind of way out, some solution to the problem, or that fear might not be as powerful of a tool as you'd like. With positive emotions, what we tend to see is that if somebody's feeling good and doesn't necessarily recognize how that good thing can help them, again, they can embrace the good feelings, but not necessarily have their attitudes changed or formed through those good feelings. If we're looking at things that can get us in a subtle way, one of the things that can impact us actually relates to things we've discussed before. How just changing our behaviors, our movements, can have an impact on our thoughts and emotions. There was actually two researchers in 2003 that ran this very intriguing study where they invited college participants to come in and listen to some persuasive arguments while also listening to music in the background. Actually, I think they were reading persuasive arguments, if I recall correctly. Half the participants were told to sort of sway to the music while they were listening to it and reading the passages. So they were instructed to move their heads back and forth in sort of a no-like movement. Others were asked to bop or bob their heads to the music, unknowingly, essentially saying yes, yes, yes with their head over and over again. And what Bernal and Petty were able to find in this weird manipulation study is that when people were asked how much they agreed with different arguments, people tended to be a little bit more in agreement with the arguments while they were nodding their heads yes than when they were swaying them back and forth in a no motion. Their insistence was that people couldn't possibly pick up on that's what they were trying to do, and they weren't recognizing that they were saying no, 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 yes, yes, yes over and again, and it was just their brain's feedback loop getting them to agree more or disagree more with messages because of their emotions. Others have maybe contended that people were a little bit more attuned to it, and others have also questioned the potency of these effects, arguing that it was minimal at best. But there has been subsequent research that has suggested that if there is a trusted name or somebody that does say as they're talking to us, shake their head yes over and over again, we're forced to listen to those things a little bit more closely, to maybe shake our head yes through our mirror neurons, and in doing so, embrace those messages a little bit more than if we, say, didn't get those mediums presented to us. And it again highlights how not only the category of a message is important, but the attempt within that message is equally important when we're looking at how much persuasion you can actually evoke in an individual. Another recent avenue that we've gone down in looking at persuasion relates to something that's popped up in a couple classes now, and that's cultural psychology. As we started to look at the different social avenues that were really important within the United States, people understanding that the differences between cultures started to question how effective some of the more commonly used techniques in the United States would actually be across cultures. One of the main contrasts that people focus their attention on is one that we've revisited a couple times in this class, the difference between what we call independent and interdependent cultures. Often you'll hear them referred to as Western versus East Asian societies. In our independent culture, when we try to evoke positive emotions or even fear, more often than not, the messages surrounding those emotions try to get people moved in a direction by focusing on how buying a product or doing something can set you apart from other individuals, can make you superior to other people. In interdependent cultures, those attempts to kind of convince people that they can be set apart from people often don't work. In fact, sometimes they can be counterproductive. In those interdependent societies, messages that focus on how you can fit in, how you can gain status while still remaining in the group, seem to be the more effective tools of persuasion within that culture. And there's numerous examples of how this is highlighted, but one of my favorites actually pertains back to the 2008 Olympics when they were actually held in China. One particular company named Adidas, which I'm sure most of you have heard of since they're still around today, that wanted to push their shoe brand and clothing brand, did this kind of advertising onslaught building up to the Olympics. And they advertised not only in the United States, but throughout Europe and Asia and all the other places around the world. But each message they presented, they attempted to cater to the culture that they were looking at. In the United States, posters and advertisements like the one you see pictured in the upper left-hand corner were everywhere. They highlighted individual athletes training for the Olympics in this kind of isolated environment, showing how they had pulled themselves away from the pack through their steadfast resolve to be superior. In essence, suggesting that the people that are the best are the ones that use Adidas. Where in China and many other countries that had this collectivist philosophy, posters that were presented were like the one that you see in the lower right-hand corner. You see one of 3 volleyball players who, as you can tell, are still part of a collective group working together, but having this kind of high status, this elite kind of, status within the group that was really highlighted by their use of Adidas products and their work to kind of stay in the population, stay a part of the group while getting that special privilege. This is not just happenstance. This is not something that Adidas just did randomly. They essentially recognized, like many social psychologists and advertisers, that what matters most to an individual is somewhat dependent upon the culture that they come from. And in fact, there's been studies that have shown the efficacy of different messages can shift as people become acculturated from one group to the other. And all of this highlights how complicated it is to make a message, be it central or peripheral, as efficacious as you could possibly make it be. And this brings me to some really interesting spots. So far, we've been talking a lot about things that people have done to try to make persuasive messages more potent. It's also probably important to note that we've run down some avenues that haven't been as fruitful as we'd originally thought. One of the most commonly cited examples of persuasion research that went awry was a series of studies done back in the 1950s by a gentleman named James Vicary, who was interested in something that you've probably heard of before, something called subliminal messages. What Vicary did in the 50s was he convinced a number of different movie companies to try to increase their sales and try to quantify how much these sales had increased by embedding messages within the reels of the movies that they were showing audiences in their theaters. These messages were shown at such a fast clip. They were only in a couple slides, something that was too fast for the brain to recognize even happening. They'd show these people these fast clips of messages like drink Coca-Cola or hungry, eat popcorn. And they do this in a handful of the movies and a handful of the theaters across the country. And what Vicary wanted to see was whether or not these messages, even though they would occur at what we call subliminal level, a point where these people wouldn't consciously recognize them, could have an impact on the purchasing of Coca-Cola products and popcorn. And in Vicary's numerous studies that he ran in publications, he was insistent that not only did this have effect, but it was a very robust effect, essentially sending sales of popcorn and Coca-Cola through the roof at the theaters that utilized this technique. And it led to a pretty big scare within the United States and other places about the impact that these subliminal messages could have. There's still actually some residual effects of this today, where parents worry that certain movie companies are embedding messages to indoctrinate their children into the film and in ways that we don't even know. There's people that created movies like The Manchurian King and other ones, suggesting that we could mind wash people and find ways to manipulate them in ways they were completely unaware of, that they kind of built off of this research of Vicary's. It's not that Vicary came up with the idea on his own, mind you. He was building off of others that had insisted how important these subliminal messages could be. But it's also important to note that in social research, we do tend to question these types of results and check the validity of them. There was another researcher in the 1970s named Weir, when he read this information, and argued that these results that Vicary reporting just seemed fictitious, almost too good to be true. So Weir and several other colleagues and people in the field started to try to replicate the results that Vicary had obtained. And what they found was what seemed like kind of irrefutable evidence that Vicary either just completely came up with the statistics that he was presenting, or he did something extra to manipulate the environment to cause the effects that he was reporting. Regardless, what Weir and other social psychologists have contended since the 1970s was that subliminal messages, despite our fear of them, are extremely ineffective. If we're looking at getting people to form or change attitudes on a subliminal level, it's usually not about having these things that we don't recognize and changing our behaviors, but it's things that we maybe identify, recognize, that we're not necessarily resistant to, that can cause persuasion. Or it can be, in some cases, things that are right in our face that can be the most persuasive messages out there. And this leads me to another topic. If we're not just looking at how we can make messages persuasive, but how we can diffuse the persuasiveness, our researchers have looked at that as well. One of the topics that was explored a lot in the 1960s was this idea of something called attitude inoculation. ways where you could prevent people from being exposed to or manipulated from messages, and in doing so, make them less likely to be persuaded when they encounter them. With attitude inoculation, what you're doing is essentially inoculating somebody from a message the same way you would inoculate a person from a virus. For those of you that don't know much about medicine, you might be surprised to know that when you get an inoculation from something like the flu or another type of health-related issue, what most of the time you're getting is either deadened or very weakened forms of the virus or things that you're trying to be inoculated from inserted into your body in a way where your body can essentially attack it, defeat it, overcome it in kind of an easy way, but in doing so, strengthen its ability to resist the actual pathogen or actual virus or whatever it is that might invade our body in the future. And attitude inoculations sort of work the same way. Or if, say, a parent wants to get their child to avoid the temptation of drinking when their friends try to convince them to do so, they say practice with their kids by giving them really crummy arguments that the kids can easily bat down. And in doing so, when these kids encounter real life examples of people trying to persuade them, because they built up that tolerance, the ability to kind of resist that persuasion, they're much more apt to be able to kind of avoid being persuaded if they don't want to be persuaded. It's important to note that, of course, this only works when we don't want to be persuaded on something and when we're made aware of it to begin with. And this brings me to another really interesting topic called the forewarning effect. Numerous studies have shown that when persuasive messages are sprung upon us, they're especially potent. But if we know somebody's coming in, trying to persuade us, trying to get us to feel something or change our opinion of something, that person has a very big mountain to climb. My favorite example of this is actually something from my own life. I don't know how many of you know this at this point since, well, you're listening to me online here, but my last name is Gotti. But if you look at how it's spelled, you might think my last name would be Gade. And that weird quirk, even though it was sometimes annoying in class, was actually very advantageous for my family at home when telemarketers were very common when I was growing up. If we would get a call and somebody would ask for Mr. or Mrs. Gade, we'd know instantly that this was not somebody we knew. It was not somebody that knew about who we were. And it flagged us to know that we were about to get somebody trying to sell us on something. If they said our name correctly, well, then we were more willing to listen to that message, assuming that we weren't about to get sold on whatever somebody was going to try to sell us on. This is something that many advertisers are acutely aware of, and that's how they've come up with ways to divide messages and packages that come across almost as just informational stuff that just so happen to have a product or something tied to it. It's still to this day, though, very challenging for many sales individuals to even get their foot in the door, simply because of how powerful this forewarning effect can be. If somebody knows that somebody's coming to try to get them to change their attitudes or form them, that person is significantly, the person trying to change those attitudes, that is, significantly less likely to have any impact because of it. There is, however, some backlash sometimes when you do try to get people to resist persuasive messages. And this was actually something that was discovered as attitude inoculation started to become popular. It's this idea of something that we call the reactance theory. This notion that if we try to get people to not be persuaded by others, we might, if we try to make out that message is demonized or maybe taboo, sometimes have the opposite effect from what we intended. Numerous studies have shown that groups that treat certain behaviors or ideas as things you shouldn't even think about or pursue tend to actually sometimes cause those people they're trying to get to avoid those messages to be more receptive of them in the future. One of the classic examples of this that many people studying reacting theory often cite is a drug training program that's kind of fallen by the wayside in recent years called DARE. Back in the 1980s, 90s, and even early 2000s, DARE was this program that was utilized in many elementary and junior high schools around the world, where these advisors would come in, tell students about all of these different drugs and how they were horrible for us, and we would essentially die on the spot if we considered trying any of them. They created this kind of fear, this terror of these drugs in lots of individuals without giving a lot of clarity as to kind of why these things were so unbelievably horrible. And what numerous studies showed was that training programs like that might have worked for some of the population, but they actually had the opposite effect on other percentages of the population. There were individuals that when they were told don't do it just because, that suddenly became significantly more intrigued by those programs. Early drinking, early smoking, early drug use behaviors often were tied to the implementation of these programs in a large number of places. It's very impossible to kind of sometimes tease out some of the societal things that were also probably impacting changes that were happening at the time. But in essence, there's many social psychologists that still contend to this day that if we're going to try to use attitude inoculation or some other technique to get people to be less receptive to persuasive messages, we don't want to go to the extreme to where we treat that message as taboo, something you should just avoid regardless, or you might actually produce this weird reactance effect in those that we're trying to inoculate. And this brings me to, well, really another big topic that we're going to start exploring. The end effects of all of this persuasion that we're getting to. Obviously, we've been talking a lot about how we form attitudes and how we can change them, because there's this notion of how those things eventually lead to our behaviors. And you might have noticed, I haven't talked a lot about those behaviors that follow in tow. And that's what we're going to be getting to in the next module. And we focus on how, once those attitudes are formed, we can get people to act in specific ways. And that's what we'll be digesting or dissecting, I guess, when we talk about the topic of conformity. For today, I'm going to close up. Thank you for listening. Hope you all have a wonderful day. And hopefully, I'll see most of you very soon.